The woman clenched a glowing crystal in her fist, and a blue radiance poured from her hand, healing the dying child. A naked stranger watched from 10 paces away. The magic was real. And the first thing his engineer's brain noted was that this was no miracle. That word is too grand. But let's go back 3 days. Dan opens his eyes and sees the cave ceiling. The flickering light of a torch dances across the wet walls. It smells of smoke and wild animals. He tries to sit up and freezes. 7 people stand in a semicircle, skins on their shoulders, spears in their hands, spearheads pointed at his face. Flint. Unpolished. Paleolithic. The engineer inside him registers this before fear sets in. Because if he thinks about what's really happened, he'll scream. A young woman with an ochre-painted face steps forward and says something. Guttural syllables. He doesn't understand a word. Dan raises his palms. I'm not an enemy. This gesture worked in Kenya and in Bolivia. The spears lower, to his finger. He looks at himself. No t-shirt, no jeans. Naked. Skin covered in silvery dust that's melting before his eyes. A warrior pokes him in the shoulder with a spear shaft. Get up. He stands up. His legs are shaking, not from the cold. The last thing he remembered was a flash of headlights in the mirror. A blow. A jerk upward by the sternum. And now he stands barefoot before people who don't know what metal is. They lead him outside. The light stings his eyes. He looks up and sees the sun, and next to it, 2 pale disks, moons, in the daytime. To the left, another one, 4 moons in the daytime sky. His legs buckle. He sits right down on the ground. This isn't Earth. The warriors laugh at the naked man who has sat down and is staring at the sky with his mouth open. Dan looks around, and then the generator kicks in. The main system is Dan Warwick from Pittsburgh, a 29-year-old mechanical engineer who loved motorcycles and used to call us on Sundays. This system is lying on the floor and screaming, but the generator is working. The river below is wide and fast. The rocks on the bank are smooth, which means the current is strong. A cliff across the way. Limestone, clay, something reddish, maybe ore. The forest is dense, which means there's plenty of rain. A steady wind from the west. Good draft. You can work with this. They put him in a side cave. They post a warrior at the entrance. Not to guard, to watch. Dan thinks they have it. Flint spears, hides. They strike fire with flint. A sled by the trail means no wheel. No pots means no pottery. No metal, no wheel, no writing. And he has everything he's ever learned. With these hands, he built his first forge at 17. Repaired turbines in Honduras. Work with this, Warwick. On the first day, he stays silent and watches. How they cut meat with scrapers. How they haul water in gourds for half a kilometer. Every time, his brain comes up with 3 ways to do it better. But he's a naked stranger who doesn't know the language. First, survive. Then speak. Then build. In the evening, an old woman comes and brings meat and berries. He puts his hand to his chest. Thank you. She bows her head and leaves. The best meal of his life because he is alive. On the second day, he goes to the river. He drinks. He looks up. 5 moons. Yesterday there were 4. And then he sees her. A young woman with ochre on her face. She stands over a sick child with a hot forehead and wheezing breath. She takes out a crystal the size of a walnut, transparent with a blue glow. She clenches it in her fist, and blue light pours from her hand. The fever subsides. The breathing evens out. Magic. Real. Not a trick. He's an engineer. He believes in thermodynamics and the laws of conservation. And he just saw a glowing hand. But his mind latches onto something else. The crystal has gone out. It was a stone with fire inside. Now it's a dull pebble. It burned itself out entirely for a single child. Wasteful. The word comes to him on its own, and the engineer inside begins to calculate. The third day is a turning point. It's getting cold. The wind carries a damp chill. An old woman struggles with a flint at the cave entrance. A spark falls on the damp grass and goes out. Once. Twice. 3 times. Her hands shake from the cold. The children shiver around her, waiting for warmth. Dan has spent the whole day gathering dry moss on the southern cliff and stripping birch bark. He sits down, gestures for the flint, rubs the moss into dust, rolls the bark into a nest, strikes a spark. The moss smolders. He leans over and blows. Gently. Let him live as his father taught him. A small flame rises, kindling, twigs, a branch as thick as his arm. In a minute, a hot, steady fire is burning. Everyone gathers around. Women, children, warriors who pretend not to be looking. Dan points to the moss, at the birch bark, at himself, and says the one word he overheard. Kai. Look. The old woman isn't smiling, but she's looking differently. She sees a man who knows how to make fire. In the morning, 5 women stand in front of his cave and wait. They want to learn. He shows them. Moss, birch bark, a spark, blow slowly. By noon, the whole camp can start a fire in a minute instead of half an hour. A gray-haired chief with scars on his face arrives. He watches as the children laugh at their first campfires. He says one word to the shaman. Leave. The spear at the entrance to Dan's cave disappears. From then on, the days blend into a rhythm. He points to an object and waits for a word. Stone, water, fire, sky, moon. 10 words on the first day, 20 on the third. The children help and laugh at his accent. A girl of about 7 named Tira sits down next to him and repeats the word until he says it correctly. On the 5th day, a hunter brings a beast resembling a cross between a bear and a badger, the size of a calf. Dan asks for flint. He walks to the cliff. He finds obsidian, black and glassy. He strikes it evenly and precisely. A chip, another. 20 minutes later, he holds a knife in his hands. Not just a flake, a knife with the correct blade geometry and a thin edge. He'd seen this with the reenactors at the festival where he went with his father. He watched for 3 hours and memorized every movement. He approaches the carcass and cuts. The blade slices through the meat like butter. The senior hunter, the one who had poked him with a spear, holds out his hand. Let me try. He cuts. He looks at Dan. And for the first time, he speaks without mockery. Respect. Small, but respect. Dan starts making knives, every evening at the cliff's edge. Obsidian and bone handles. 10 a week. He gives them away for free. And the shamaness watches. Her name is Isa. A little over 20. Sharp cheekbones. Dark, fiery eyes. Smooth, parallel scars on her forearms. Ritual scars. She looks at him with concern. He's doing what the spirits are supposed to do. And he's doing it better. On the 7th day, he sees her healing again. An old man with a festering wound on his shin. A crystal. A squeeze. Blue light. The stone goes out in 3 seconds. The wound closes halfway. Isa staggers. Blood runs from her nose. She wipes it with her palm and walks away without looking back. Magic that works through pain. Wasteful, dangerous, inefficient. Dan picks up the dead crystal she threw away. A murky, warm stone. Inside, something like a structure. He feels no magic. Not a drop. But he feels the stone, the weight, the facets. It has a crystal lattice, like quartz, like a piezoelectric. He tucks the stone into his bosom. He doesn't know why yet, but he knows he'll come back. Engineers always return to interesting problems. The first week is behind him. He's alive. 20 words of a foreign language, 10 knives distributed to the tribe, a spot by the fire, and one dead crystal in a leather pouch. At night he listens to the water dripping deep in the cave. 412 drops before sleep. He used to count them to keep his mind off. Now he counts to fall asleep. The difference is small, but it's there. On the 8th day, Dan woke up to a scream, a child's cry from the depths of the cave. He jumped up and ran toward the sound. A boy of about 4 was sitting on the floor, clutching his leg. A sharp stone lay nearby, a laceration on the foot, blood on the floor. Nia was already there. She was pressing moss against the wound, but the moss was soaked with blood and wasn't helping. Dan dropped to his knees. He looked at the wound. Deep, dirty. The stone had entered at an angle and torn the skin 3 centimeters. If he didn't wash it out, it would get infected. In this world, infection meant death. He ran to the river. He scooped water into a gourd. He returned. He washed the wound. The boy was screaming. Naya was holding him. Dan looked around. He needed something to stop the bleeding and cover the wound. He remembered. Spiderwebs. He had seen huge spiderwebs at the entrance to the side caves, thick, almost like fabric. He ran off and gathered some spiderwebs. He washed the wound again. He applied the spiderwebs in layers. He pressed down. The bleeding stopped. The spiderwebs worked like a natural bandage. He knew this from books. The ancient Greeks used spiderwebs on wounds, antibacterial properties plus clotting. Naya looked at his hands. Then she looked him in the face. For the first time in a week, she spoke to him directly. 3 words. He didn't understand a single one, but she pointed at the boy, then at his hands, then pressed her palm to her chest. He understood the gesture. Thank you. 2 days later, the boy was running. The wound had healed cleanly. No infection. Dan sat by the fire and laid out sticks in front of him. Each stick was a word. He grouped them by category: objects, actions, people, numbers, directions. The tribe's language turned out to be logical. A root system. Suffixes for actions, prefixes for size. Stone is tar. A large stone is grotar. A small stone is titar. Water is ne. Fire is kai. He wrote with a stick on the ground, and little Tira sat beside him, correcting his pronunciation. By the 10th day, he could construct 3-word phrases. Give me water. Big stone. The fire is burning. By the 15th, 5-word phrases. I am going to the river. He made knives. By the 2nd week, he switched from obsidian to flint. Obsidian is sharper but brittle. Flint is stronger and more abundant. He experimented with shapes: wide blades for butchering, narrow ones for sewing, skin scrapers with the right sharpening angle. The hunters began coming to him with orders. They gestured what they needed, and he made it. One hunter, tall, muscular, with short hair and a scar on her chin. She came and silently placed her old knife in front of him, worn down to a stub. Then she pointed to her hand. She had a small palm, a narrow grip. Dan understood. She needed a knife that fit her hand. He spent half a day making it. He adjusted the handle. He wrapped it in leather, soft side facing in, so it wouldn't chafe. He handed it to her. She took it, tried it out, sliced a test piece of meat, looked at the knife, looked at Dan, nodded, and left. It was the first time he'd made not just a thing, but a thing for a specific person. His father had told him this in the workshop in Pittsburgh. Don't fix the car, fix the person's problem with the car. Dan missed his father. His heavy hands, the smell of metal shavings, the Sunday calls to Mom. At night he lay there staring into the darkness, and sometimes he would shake. Not from the cold, from the fact that he would never call Mom again. Naya saw it. One night when he couldn't sleep and was sitting by the cold fire hugging his knees, she came over. She didn't say anything. She just sat down next to him. She put her hand on his shoulder, a warm, heavy hand. They sat like that until dawn. In the morning, she got up and went to cook. He went to the river, and they never spoke of it again. By the third week, he had begun experimenting with clay. The riverbank was full of it, red, rich, malleable. He dug it up with his hands, hauled it back to camp, and molded it. The first pot, thick-walled, uneven, crooked. He dried it for 3 days, then put it in the fire. The pot burst. The second one, too. The third one cracked, but didn't fall apart. The fourth one survived. A small cup with thick walls and an uneven bottom. An ugly thing. But it held water. He poured water into it. He placed the cup in front of Nia. She picked up the cup, turned it over in her hands, looked at him, then at the cup. Then she scooped some water into it and drank. For the first time in 2 weeks, she smiled. Tira brought her friends over, 5 girls aged 6 to 10. They wanted to mold. Dan showed them. You knead the clay. You squeeze out the air bubbles. You roll it into a sausage, stack them in rings, smooth the sides, dry them. By the end of the 3rd week, the tribe had 12 pots, half cracked during firing. 6 survived. 6 pots in which to cook food instead of frying it on a stone. 6 pots in which to store water and grain. 6 pots that changed the diet of 300 people. He hadn't thought about it on such a scale. He'd just been making pots. But Nea had. She came up to him in the evening, while he was washing the clay off his hands by the river. She pointed at the pots, then at the people. Then she said a long sentence of which he understood only 2 words. Children. Yes. The children are eating hot food. For the first time. He nodded. She stood beside him and looked at the river. Then she quietly said something else. He caught only 1 word. Good. In the 4th week, Isa came to him. Not to the workshop corner where he worked with stone and clay, but to his cave. At night. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting, examining the extinguished crystal by the light of a small fat lamp he'd made himself from a stone bowl and mutton fat, with a wick of twisted moss. Isa entered without warning. She sat down across from him. She was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, slowly, choosing simple words. She knew he was learning the language. She asked what he was doing with the spirit stone. He didn't understand everything, but he understood the main point. The spirit stone is a crystal. She wanted to know why he had taken it. Dan chose his words carefully, slowly, clumsily. I'm looking at it. I'm learning. It's an interesting stone. She looked at him and said a long sentence. He pieced together the fragments. Spirits. Power. You mustn't. Dangerous. He understood. She was warning him. Crystals belong to the spirits and shamans. An outsider must not touch them. He placed the crystal on the ground between them. He held out his palm toward her. Show me. She looked at him for a few seconds. Then she took a living crystal out of her pouch. Glowing. Blue. The size of a grape. She squeezed it. The glow intensified. Dan saw a spasm cross her face. Pain. She directed the glow toward his palm. Warm light. A tingling sensation. And nothing. The magic didn't enter him. The light flowed around his hand like water flows around a stone. Isa opened her eyes. She looked at him with an expression he could already read. Amazement. Empty. He is empty. No mana. None at all. She said 1 word. He remembered it. Torkai. Later he would learn that it meant empty vessel. A rarity. 1 in 1,000. A person in whom there is not a drop of magical energy. For the tribe, this was considered a curse. For Isa, it was an explanation. He doesn't steal the spirit's power. He can't even touch it. He makes things, just things, with his hands, without magic. She left. didn't say another word. But the next day, she didn't come to look at him with worry. She came to look with curiosity. That was better. In the 5th week, he found the ropes. More precisely, he found out how the tribe made ropes and was horrified. They twisted strips of raw hide. The hide dried and became stiff, but not strong. It tore under strain. The knots didn't hold. He showed them how to weave with sinew. 3 strands, cross. 3 strands, cross. A simple braid. A rope made of 3 twisted sinew strands was 3 times stronger than a leather one. The hunters tested it. They tied a stone to it. They pulled. The leather rope snapped. The sinew rope held. They looked at Dan, that very hunter who had jabbed him with a spear on the first day. His name was Kenner, the chief's son, young, strong, broad-shouldered with quick eyes and a heavy jaw. He looked at the rope, then at Dan, and for the first time, Dan saw in his face not respect, but something else. Jealousy. Kenner was the tribe's best hunter, the strongest, the fastest, the chief's heir. And then a skinny, naked stranger comes along and, in a month, does things that change people's lives. Things that neither strength nor speed can provide. Dan remembered that look. By the 6th week, he could already hold a simple conversation, in short phrases, with mistakes, but they understood him, and he understood them. And at the end of the 6th week, he asked the chief for permission to start a project for the first time. He went to see old Grog, sat down across from him. The chief looked at him from under heavy brows. Dan spoke slowly. "I want to build an oven, a hot stone, for pots, for warmth. I need a place. I need hands." Grog was silent for a long time. Then he asked a question. Dan didn't catch it all, but he got the gist. "Why? Why do you need this?" Dan answered. "The children are freezing. The old people are freezing. The fire in the cave smokes. It's hard to breathe. A kiln is a fire without smoke, warmth without coughing." Grog looked at him for another minute. Then he turned to Kenner, who was standing at the entrance. He said 3 words. "Give him men." Kenner clenched his jaw, but he nodded. In the morning, 4 men stood before Dan and waited for instructions. He led them to the clay cliff. They began to dig. Building the oven turned out to be harder than he thought. Not because he didn't know how. He knew. A domed structure, clay walls, stones in the base, air intake from below, a chimney on top. He'd built one like this at his father's cottage when he was 22. The difficulty lay elsewhere. The 4 men Kenner had provided didn't understand what he wanted from them. It wasn't the language. The language already allowed him to explain the basics. They didn't understand the idea itself. A fire in a stone house. Why put stones around the fire? The fire burns even without stones. Dan drew on the ground. He gestured. He explained it 3 times. 4. 5. One of the men left on the 2nd day. He just got up and left. 3 remained. Dan didn't call him back. Those who stayed worked, slowly, with distrust. But they worked. They hauled clay from the cliff. They kneaded it with their feet, adding sand and fine straw that Dan had asked Nea for. They shaped bricks, raw, heavy bricks that dried in the sun for 3 days. A base of flat stones laid in a circle with a diameter of 1.5 meters. Walls of bricks held together with clay mortar. Each row tilted slightly inward. A dome. An air intake at ground level. A small opening through which air is drawn in when the fire burns inside. Natural draft. A chimney on top. A clay pipe that he had molded and dried separately. It took 10 days to build. On the 6th day, Kenner came to watch. He stood to the side with his arms crossed over his chest. He watched as 3 men carried out the stranger's instructions. His face was stony. Dan saw him but didn't react. Not the time. On the 11th day, the oven was ready. It was ugly, crooked. The dome had sagged slightly on the left side. The chimney was a bit shorter than needed, but it was ready. He lit a fire inside. The flames roared. The draft was working. The smoke rose up through the pipe instead of spreading through the cave. Heat built up in the walls. An hour later, the clay walls were hot. 2 hours later, they were red hot. Dan placed 20 pots. Raw ones, sun-dried but not fired. He sealed the opening with a stone. He tossed some firewood through the air vent. He waited. The tribe gathered around. Everyone. 300 people. They watched the stone dome from which smoke, a steady hum, and heat emanated. The children stood in front, the adults behind them. Isa stood to the side with her arms crossed. Nea stood next to Dan. He waited 8 hours. He added firewood. He monitored the draft. He cleared the ash pit twice with a stick. By evening, the heat began to subside. He let the kiln cool until morning. In the morning, he opened it. Of the 20 pots, 17 had survived. 3 had burst. The rest rang when he tapped them with his ring, a thin, high-pitched ring. Fired pottery. Durable, watertight, and beautiful. Reddish with dark spots from the uneven heat. Nea took 1 pot. She poured water into it. The water didn't seep through the walls. It always seeped through the damp pots. Not anymore. Nea placed the pot on the coals. She brought the water to a boil. She threw in the meat and herbs she knew. An hour later, she ladled the first hot soup in the history of the Greystone tribe into bowls. Clay bowls. Not animal skulls, not hollowed-out stones. Bowls she had molded herself, and that Dan had fired in his ugly, crooked kiln. The children drank the soup, burned their hands, and laughed. The old woman, whose name Dan never learned, sat by the kiln and warmed her hands against the hot walls and cried. Quietly, without a sound, just tears running down her wrinkled face. She was warm. Perhaps for the first time in the last 10 winters, she was truly warm. Grog approached Dan. He placed a hand on his shoulder, the heavy hand of the old chief. He said nothing. There was no need. Dan nodded. Then he walked to the river, sat down on the bank, and stayed there for a long time. 1 pot is nothing. A stove is a start, but not the real start. The real start is copper. He looked at the cliff on the other side, dark, reddish streaks in the rock. He'd noticed them from the very first day. A reddish color, green streaks, malachite, copper oxide, copper ore. It lay on the other side of the river, waiting for him. But the river stood between him and the ore, wide, cold, fast-flowing. And there was another problem: temperature. Copper melts at 1,080 degrees. His furnace reached a maximum of 700, maybe 800. That was enough for pottery, not for copper. He needed a blast furnace. He needed bellows. He needed coal, not firewood. He needed time. He lay awake at night and thought. He did the math in his head. Charcoal, burning wood without air, a pit in the ground, wood, clay on top, a small hole for the gases to escape. 3 days of burning, charcoal. Coal burns hotter than firewood, 800 to 900 degrees. Still not enough. Bellows. Leather bags with a wooden valve. You pump and air is blown into the bellows. Forced air supply. With the bellows and coal, you can reach 1,100. That'll do. He got to work. In the morning, he asked Nea for 2 hides. She gave them to him without asking. He began sewing the bellows. 2 leather bags with small wooden slats at the inlet. The slats worked like valves. You pull the bellows toward you and air enters through the valve. You push, and air exits through the nozzle. A clay nozzle that he inserted into the side wall of the new furnace. Not the first one. He was building a second one. Smaller, with thick walls, with a long nozzle for the bellows. A blast furnace. At the same time, he burned coal. He dug a 1 meter by 1 meter pit, filled it with firewood, set it on fire, covered it with clay slabs, sealed the cracks, left a single hole the size of a fist. It smoked for 3 days. On the 4th day, he took off the lid. Charcoal. Black, light, and crisp. Real charcoal. He scooped it into a basket and carried it to the bellows. He poured it into the bellows. He lit it. He began pumping the bellows. The fire roared. The flame changed color from orange to white. The heat was so intense that it burned the skin at arm's length. He placed a piece of stone with green veins inside. Malachite. He had found the ore after all, not on the other side of the river. He found it closer. In a ravine behind the forest, a half-hour's walk away. A small outcrop. Red and green stones sticking out of the ground. He brought back 10 fist-sized pieces. He crushed them with a stone hammer. He poured them into the furnace on top of the red-hot coals. And he began pumping the bellows. 1, 2, 3, 5 minutes. 10, 20. His hands burned from the effort. Sweat poured into his eyes. He didn't stop. The stone was melting. The green stone turned liquid in the white fire. It dripped down. It gathered at the bottom of the furnace in a small red puddle. Copper. Liquid copper. He stopped pumping. He stepped back. He sat down on the ground. His hands were shaking. His heart was pounding. He looked at the reddish glow deep inside the crucible, and his hands trembled. Not from exhaustion, from realization. He had just smelted a stone into metal, in a world where metal doesn't exist. When the crucible cooled, he took it apart. At the bottom lay an ingot, small, about the size of 2 fingers, shapeless, dirty, with bubbles and flecks of slag. But it was copper. He took the ingot in his hand, heavy, warm, red. Dan stood alone by his furnace in the woods behind the camp, holding the first piece of copper in this world. He didn't call anyone, didn't show it off, didn't celebrate. He stood there holding the copper and thinking about his father, about the forge at the cottage, about the first knife he had forged at 17, crooked and blunt and completely useless. His father had hung it on the wall in the workshop and said, "The first knife is always bad, but the second one will be better." Dan set the ingot down on a rock. He picked up another, heavier one, and began to strike. The copper yielded. Not like steel, softer, more pliable. It flattened under the blows. He heated it in the coals and struck again, heated and struck. 3 hours. By evening, he held a knife in his hands, a copper knife, a blade as long as his palm, thick and uneven, with visible marks from the blows, roughly sharpened. The handle wrapped in a strip of leather, an ugly thing. The first metal knife in the history of this world. He brought it back to camp, silently. He approached Naya, who was cleaning fish with a stone scraper by the fire. He placed the knife in front of her. She picked it up, turned it over. The copper glinted in the firelight, reddish, warm, heavier than stone but lighter than it looked. Naya ran her finger along the blade. Sharp. She looked at Dan, for a long time. Then she took a fish and cut it open with the copper knife. The blade entered the flesh effortlessly, cleanly, smoothly. She cut open one fish, then another, then a third. Then she stopped and looked at the knife in her hand, and at him. People began to gather around. Someone had seen the flash. Hunters approached and watched. Kenner pushed his way forward. He took the knife from Naya's hand. She handed it over without resistance. He turned it over in his hand, tested the blade with his finger. Then he struck a wooden stick with it. The copper sank into the wood. Not deeply. The knife was too soft for chopping. But it had sunk into the wood. A stone knife would have broken. Kenner looked at Dan. There was something new in his eyes. Not jealousy. Fear. Isa was the last to approach. She didn't take the knife. She stood and looked at the copper, at the reddish gleam. Then she looked at Dan and said a phrase that he understood completely this time. "You don't steal from the spirits. You make it yourself." He nodded. She turned and walked away. But before disappearing into her cave, she paused for a moment. She turned back, and he saw neither anxiety nor curiosity on her face. He saw the beginning of respect. That night he didn't count drops of water. He counted what he needed. More ore, more coal, a second furnace, an assistant at the bellows because pumping alone is impossible for more than an hour. Molds for wet sand casting. A hammer, a real hammer, not a stone. An anvil, a large flat stone. He thought and counted and planned, and for the first time in 7 weeks in this world, he fell asleep not from exhaustion, but from peace of mind. He knew what to do. He knew how to do it. And he had hands that remembered. Dan began forging the next morning. He couldn't wait. Every day without metal is a day when children cut themselves on sharp splinters, and hunters break their spearheads on the first strike. He set up the forge closer to the camp, not in the woods, but in an open clearing at the foot of the cliff. Let them see. Let them understand. He needed an assistant at the bellows. A young guy, about 16, volunteered first. Quiet, skinny, with long arms and attentive eyes. His name was Wren. He came in the morning, sat down by the bellows, and waited. Dan showed him how to pump. Smoothly, rhythmically. Not too fast. Keep the heat up, don't stoke the fire. Wren got it the first time. His hands turned out to be stronger than they looked. They worked as a team. Dan crushed the ore, poured it into the furnace. Wren pumped the bellows. The copper melted and flowed to the bottom. Dan pulled out the ingot with tongs he'd made from 2 wooden sticks wrapped in rawhide. He heated it over the coals. He forged it on a flat stone. He struck it with a stone hammer. A spearhead. His first copper spearhead. Heavier than flint but stronger. It doesn't split from the impact. It can be sharpened again when it gets dull. A second tip. A third. By the end of the first week of forging, he had 8 spearheads and 4 knives. He handed out the spearheads to the hunters. They tied them to the shafts with leather straps. They went hunting. They returned with 2 heavy paws. Before, it took 5 spears and 3 days of tracking to bring down a single heavy paw. With the copper tips, 2 spears and 1 day were enough. Meat, hides, bones, fat, tendons. 2 heavy paws meant a 2-week food supply for the entire tribe. The hunters returned, and there was a celebration in the camp. The children ate the meat. The women scraped the hides with new copper knives. Dan sat by the forge, drinking water from a clay cup, very tired and very content. Naya brought him food, the best cut. She set it before him every evening, and every evening he tried to explain to her that he didn't need the best cut. She ignored him every evening. Kenner watched. He no longer showed his fear openly. He was smarter. He came to Dan on the 3rd day of forging and asked for a spear. He didn't ask. He demanded it. He was the chieftain's heir. He was entitled to the best weapon. Dan looked at him. Kenner was a head taller than Dan. His shoulders were 1.5 feet wider, muscles like a gymnast's, scars on his arms from hunting. He was a warrior and looked like a warrior. Dan nodded. "I'll make it." But Dan didn't just make him a spear. He made a spear tailored to Kenner. He watched how Kenner held the shaft, how he swung it, how he threw it. Kenner threw the spear from the hip with a step forward, left-handed. Dan weighted the tip, shifted the center of gravity closer to the blade. He made a hook on the back of the tip so the spear wouldn't fly out of the wound when pulled. Kenner took the finished spear. He took aim. He threw it at a tree from 20 paces away. The tip went in 3 fingers deep. Kenner walked over, pulled it out, looked at the hook, looked at Dan. He didn't say thank you, but he walked away with the spear, and from that day on, He no longer stood on the sidelines with his arms crossed. He began bringing in ore. He found greenish stones in the forest and in the ravines and carried them back. Not all of them were copper ore, but some were. He helped. In his own way, silently and proudly, but he helped. By the 4th month, Dan began to think about water. The tribe carried water from the river in gourds. Half a kilometer there, half a kilometer back. 10 times a day. 5 people did nothing but that. A pointless waste of energy. The river could carry the water to them on its own. He began making pipes. Clay pipes. He rolled out clay cylinders on a stick, pulled out the stick, and ended up with a hollow tube as long as his forearm. He dried them. He fired them in the kiln. He joined them with flared ends, inserting one end into the other and sealing the joint with clay. The first pipe from the river to the camp. 30 sections. 3 days of work. He dug them into the ground at a slight downward slope from the river. The river was upstream from the camp. Gravity did the rest. Water flowed through the pipes, a thin stream, steady, clean. It poured into a stone basin he had carved out at the foot of the cliff. The tribe stood and watched as the water flowed on its own, without hands, without gourds, on its own. Tira walked over to the basin. She dipped her hand in. The water was cold and clear. She looked at Dan with her serious, childlike eyes and asked, "Why does the water go up?" Dan crouched down beside her. "The water doesn't go up. The river is higher there. The water goes down." Always down, Tira thought. "But what if we want it to go up?" Dan smiled. "Then we need a wheel." She didn't understand what a wheel was. He drew a circle on the ground, sticks from the center to the edge. The water pushes the sticks. The circle spins. The circle pulls the rope. The rope lifts the bucket. Water at the top. Tira looked at the drawing. She thought for a minute. Then she said, "But why doesn't the water in the wheel get tired?" Dan opened his mouth. He closed it. He thought. It was a question about the law of conservation of energy, asked by a 7-year-old girl who didn't know the word energy. He sat with her until dark, explaining. Water doesn't get tired because it doesn't expend energy. It falls. Falling isn't work. It's what water does on its own. Just like a stone falls down. A stone doesn't get tired of falling. Tira listened. She asked questions. Each question was better than the last. By the end of the conversation, Dan realized that this was no ordinary child. She thought systematically. She saw connections. At the end, she said, "I get it. You don't know." And she left. Dan sat there and laughed, quietly, alone, by the dying fire. Isa watched the water pipe from a distance. She didn't approach or ask questions. But in the evening, she came to Dan and sat down next to him. She was silent. Then she said, "You made the water walk like a person." He shook his head. "No, the water walks on its own. I showed it the way." She looked at him. "The water spirits carry the water. You're saying the spirits aren't needed." Dan chose his words carefully. "No, I'm not saying the spirits aren't needed. I'm saying that water needs nothing but a path down. Maybe spirits do exist, but water flows down even without them." Isa was silent for a long time. Then she stood up and left. The next day she came with a crystal, alive, glowing, and she asked, "Can you make a path for this?" He didn't understand at first. Then he understood. She was asking if he could do for magic what he had done for water. Not to use up the crystal in a second, but to make it work for a long time. Like a pipe, like a path. He took the crystal, turned it over in his hands. Warm, pulsing. He didn't feel magic, but he felt a vibration, a faint one, almost imperceptible. The crystal trembled in his hands like a tiny motor. He didn't know the answer to her question yet, but he knew the answer existed, and that he would find it. "Give me time." She nodded, and she left. But before she did something she hadn't done before. She left the crystal with him. Alive, glowing, working. It was a sign of trust. By the 5th month, life in the camp had changed. The kiln was firing every day. Pottery was flowing out in a steady stream. Pots, bowls, jugs, plates. Naya organized the production. Dan showed her how to keep track. Sticks on a clay tablet. 1 stick, 1 pot. A bundle of sticks, 10 pots. She understood instantly. Moreover, she improved the system. She added symbols for different types. A circle is a pot. A stick is a knife. A triangle is a spearhead. By the end of the month, she had a complete inventory of everything Dan had produced. She came to him with the tablet and showed him. This is how many pots. Here are this many knives. Here are this many spearheads. This many people want more. He looked at her and thought, this woman, who was considered simply the one who feeds us, was a natural-born manager. She saw the flows, what comes from where and where it goes, how much is needed, for whom and when. He said, Naya, I need you. Not for work. She tilted her head. What kind of work? Counting, monitoring, managing. I do things. You make sure things get to the people who need them. She was silent. Then she nodded. A single, brief nod. From that day on, she no longer just brought him food. She would come in the morning with a chart and tell him what needed to be done that day. Who was waiting for a knife? Who needs pots? How much ore is left? Who's free to work at the furnace? She became his right-hand woman, and for the first time in 2 years since her husband's death, she looked alive. Winter came in the 6th month. Dan knew it was coming. He could tell by the trees. The conifer needles had darkened, the wind had changed. It had grown sharper, the temperature dropped by a fraction of a degree every day. He was preparing. For 2 months he had been building. He wasn't alone. Ran was with the hides. Nia was with the signs and schedules. 4 men who now worked with him voluntarily. And 10 more women who molded bricks and pipes and pots from dawn till dusk. He built 3 furnaces for heating in the large caves, dome-shaped, with chimneys, with air vents. The heat lasted all night long. 1 load of firewood for 8 hours. The children no longer slept huddled under skins, shivering from the cold. They slept by the warm walls and woke up without blue lips. He insulated the cave entrances, double layers of skins on a frame of sticks, a layer of dry moss between the skins, an air cushion. A simple principle. Air doesn't conduct heat if it isn't moved. For the first time in its history, the tribe spent the winter in warmth. But winter brought more than just cold. In the 3rd week, strangers arrived. Not enemies, refugees. 17 people, women, children, and 3 old men. From the Thin Stream tribe. They came from the north, hungry, frozen, in rags. Their tribe had been ravaged by the Red Claws. Blood Droog had come for crystals and slaves. The men were killed. The shaman was killed. The women and children who could escape did so. They walked for 5 days through the snow. 3 died along the way. Grog took them in without question. That was the law. The tribe does not abandon people, but 17 extra mouths to feed in winter is a problem. Nia came to Dan with a tablet. She showed him the calculations. There was enough food for 2 months. Winter lasts 4. Dan looked at the numbers. Sticks on clay. Simple arithmetic. 317 mouths, a 60-day supply of meat, 120 until spring. Not nearly enough. They'd have to hunt. But in winter, the big game goes into hibernation. Only small game remains. Hares and the like. Birds. Fish in the river, if the river doesn't freeze over. He thought for 3 days. On the 4th, he went to the river. He stood on the bank and looked at the water. The river hadn't frozen. The current was too fast. There were fish. He saw shadows in the depths, silvery and swift. The tribe caught fish with their hands and spears, slowly, inefficient. 2 or 3 fish a day. He made a net. From the strong ropes he had taught the tribe to weave. The weave was simple. Square mesh, stone weights at the bottom, wooden floats on top, a net 5 meters long. He set it across the current, tying it to stakes driven into the bank. He checked it in the morning. 11 fish. 11 in a single night. Effortless. No hunter standing waist-deep in icy water. Nea counted the fish and her hands trembled. Not from the cold, from the realization. 1 net would be enough for food. He made 4 nets. He set them in different spots along the river, 40 to 50 fish a day. The tribe ate fish every day, boiled in pots, with herbs that Nea had dried in the summer, hot, filling. The refugees from Thin Creek looked at the pots and the stoves and the copper knives and couldn't believe their eyes. One of the women, the eldest among the refugees, approached Den. Tall, skinny to the point of transparency, with sunken eyes and cracks on her lips from frostbite. She asked who he was. He answered, "Just a man." She shook her head. People don't do that. He didn't know what to say, because she was right. People in this world didn't do that, because no one had shown them how. In the middle of winter, he returned to the crystal. Issa had given him a living mannerite 2 months ago, and he had carried it with him every day. He couldn't sense it magically, but he could observe it. The crystal glowed with a faint blue light at night. The glow pulsed, a slow rhythm, about once every 2 seconds, like a heartbeat. When Issa or any other person with magic took it in their hand, the glow intensified. When Dan took it, nothing changed. But something did change when he placed the crystal next to copper. A copper knife placed right up against the crystal altered the pulsation. Faster, brighter. The copper was conducting something, not electricity, something else. Magical energy. He began his experiments, in secret, at night, when everyone was asleep. 2 crystals, one alive, one dead, a copper wire between them. He pulled the wire from a copper ingot, thin, uneven, but a wire. He connected the crystals with the wire. The living crystal pulsed, the dead one did not. He waited. Night. Then another. On the 3rd night, the dead crystal began to glow, dimly, barely noticeable. But it glowed. Energy flowed through the copper wire from the living crystal to the dead one, like current through a wire. Slowly, weakly, but it flowed. His hands shook when he saw it. Crystals are batteries, copper is a wire, energy is current. Shamans burned the crystal in a second because they poured all the energy in at once. As if you short-circuited a battery directly. A flash, and that's it. But if you put a conductor between the crystals, if you control the flow, if you make a circuit, that same crystal would work not for a second, but for an hour. Not an hour, but a day. Not a day, but a week. You just need to figure out how to regulate the flow. Resistance. In electrical circuits, resistance depends on the material and the thickness of the wire. It must be the same here. He tried different wire thicknesses. Thick wire, stronger current. Thin wire, weaker current. It worked. He tried different materials. Bone between the crystals, no current. Stone, no current. Wood, no current. Clay, no current. Only copper. Copper conducts magic. He sat in his little cave by the light of 2 crystals connected by copper wire and thought, if copper conducts but stone and clay do not, then stone and clay are insulators. He can build circuits. Real magical circuits. With conductors and insulators. With flow control. With different loads. It was as if Faraday had discovered electricity in a world where everyone used lightning with their bare hands. He didn't sleep until dawn. In the morning, he went to see Issa. For the first time, he came to her instead of her coming to him. She was sitting at the entrance to her cave, sorting through crystals. A small leather pouch. A dozen stones, some bright, some dull. She looked up. He sat down across from her. He showed her 2 crystals on a wire. The living one and the one that had been dead but now glowed. Issa stared at the dead crystal. She picked it up. She turned it over. The glow was faint but steady. She looked at Dan. How? He pointed to the wire. Copper. A path. The light travels through the copper. From the living one to the dead one. Slowly. For a long time. Not quickly. She looked at the wire. Then at him. Then back at the wire. Then she did he didn't expect. She took out her brightest crystal. A big one. The size of a chicken egg. She placed it on the ground. Usually she would clench it in her fist and pour all her power into it, and the crystal would flare up and go out in seconds, and blood would run from her nose. Now she looked at Dan and said, "Show me." He took the crystal. He wrapped its base with copper wire, thin wire. He ran the long wire to a small, dim crystal 5 steps away. Issa, take the big one, but don't clench it. Just hold it, quietly. She took it. She closed her eyes. A familiar spasm ran across her face, but he touched her hand. She flinched, opened her eyes. Quiet. Just a little. Just a little. She frowned, but she tried. She poured in a drop. The large crystal lit up, softly. The glow ran along the wire, slowly. It reached the small crystal. It flared up, with an even, warm blue light. And it burned. A second, 2, 5, 10, 30, a minute. Issa opened her eyes. The small crystal burned evenly and brightly. The large one in her hand had barely dimmed. She had used a drop of energy that usually burned through the entire crystal in 3 seconds. And the small crystal had been burning for a minute already. She raised her hand. She looked at it. There was no blood from her nose. There was no pain. She looked at Dan, and in her eyes was something he would remember for the rest of his life. She understood. Everything she had done before. All the pain, all the scars. None of it was necessary. Not because magic is bad, but because no one knew how to make a path for her. She sat there staring at the burning crystal, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Silently. Just like that old woman by the stove. Dan didn't touch her. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside her. When she spoke, her voice was different, quieter, younger, as if a layer of something hard had been peeled away from it. She said, "You'll change everything." He shook his head. "No, we'll change everything." She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. And for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she didn't cross her arms over her chest. Her hands lay on her knees, open, relaxed. She wasn't defending herself from him anymore. That evening, Dan sat by the fire and did the math. 1 crystal lamp is copper wire, plus 1 small mannerite, plus 1 large mannerite as the power source. A large crystal charged by Issa with a single drop of energy provides light for 5 hours. 1 full charge provides a week of continuous light. 1 shaman can charge 10 crystals a day without pain. 10 lamps. For the whole settlement. No, 20, 30. He needs more wire, more small crystals, more copper. He calculated and drew with a stick on the ground, and Nay sat next to him and wrote it down on her tablet. She didn't understand everything, but she understood numbers, and she understood that the numbers were big. "Dan, what do you see?" He looked at her. "Light. I see light in every house, warmth in every stove, water in every jug, children who aren't afraid of the dark." Naya looked at him, and she had a strange expression. Not surprise, not admiration, recognition, as if she had always known that someone like this would come. She just hadn't expected it to be a skinny stranger with burned hands and an accent. Winter was past its midpoint. There was enough food. The fishing nets were working. The stoves were warm. The water pipes carried water. 317 people lived in warmth and plenty in a world where winter usually meant the death of 1 in 10. Dan stood on a cliff above the river and looked down at the camp. Smoke from the chimneys, the glimmers of campfires at the cave entrances, voices, children's laughter, the clang of a hammer from the workshop where Wren was learning to forge under his guidance. He stood and watched and thought. This wasn't a city yet, not even a village. A camp by the caves with stoves and running water and copper knives. But this is the beginning. The real beginning. In the spring he will build walls, in the summer houses. By autumn they will have a city. In a year, an army. In 2, he will face the great eclipse with something greater than spears and hope. He looked at the camp and for the first time thought not of what he had lost, but of what he could build. Somewhere far to the south, beyond the glass desert, in the stone halls of the kingdom of Sarvain, a young woman with cold eyes listened to a scout's report. The scout spoke of the northern tribes, of a strange stranger, of metal from stone, of water that flows on its own, about a light that never goes out. Valissa al-Sarvain leaned back in her chair. She twirled the ring on her finger. A copper ring she wore on a whim. Not gold, copper. She had always loved copper, and for the first time in a long while, she became truly interested. Spring arrived with mud and noise. The river swelled from the melting snow. The banks were washed away. The water main was washed away in the very first week. 3 sections of pipe were carried away by the current. The rest cracked from the water pressure. Dan stood on the bank and looked at the wreckage. 2 months of work. Naya approached. She looked at him. He expected her to say something comforting. She said, "How many days to fix it?" He looked at her, smiled. 7. But the new one will be better. He rerouted the water line higher up the slope, buried the pipes deeper, reinforced the joints with a double layer of clay and sand, added a drainage channel in case of flooding. Excess water flowed back into the river without breaking the system. Engineering thinking. The first version is a draft. The second is the final draft. While he was repairing the water line, Kenner arrived with news. Bad news. He had gone on a reconnaissance mission north with 3 hunters. Tracks. Lots of tracks. A large band had passed through 2 days' journey away. Red Claws. Droog the Bloody had been gathering strength all winter. He had taken in the remnants of 3 ravaged tribes, not as equals, as slaves. Now he had not 50 warriors at his command, but over 100, and he was heading south, toward them. Kenner stood before Dan and Grog and spoke in an even voice. But Dan saw his hands. His fingers were gripping the spear shaft so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Kenner wasn't afraid. Kenner was furious. His land, his tribe, his people, and someone was coming to take them. Grog listened. He turned to Dan. The old chieftain wasn't asking for advice. He was asking something else. What can you do? Dan thought for 3 minutes. Everyone waited. 300 people in the camp. Of them, 40 were men fit for battle, 20 female hunters, 15 teenagers who could hold a spear. 75 fighters against over 100. Bad numbers, but numbers aren't everything. The Red Claws had flint spears and stone axes. Greystone had copper spearheads. The Red Claws have no walls. Greystone will have walls. In 2 weeks, Dan said, I need everyone, every pair of hands, everyone who can carry stones and mix clay. 2 weeks, and they won't be able to take us. Grog nodded. Kenner clenched his jaw, but he nodded too. They began building a wall. Not around the entire camp. That's impossible in 2 weeks. Dan chose a narrow spot. The camp stood at the edge of a cliff. the river to the left, a ravine to the right. The only open approach was from the front, a 60-meter strip between the river and the ravine. That's where he built the wall, a stone foundation waist-high. On top of it, a palisade of sharpened logs. In front of the wall, a knee-deep moat filled with water from a drainage channel. Not deep, not deadly, but try running with a spear through a knee-deep ditch of icy water while crossbowmen watch you from above. Crossbows. He made them at the same time as the wall, 4 of them in 2 weeks. Primitive. A wooden stock. The limbs made of bent wood, reinforced with bone plates. A bowstring made of braided sinew. A trigger mechanism consisting of a copper hook and a wooden lever. Bolts with copper tips. Each crossbow had a range of 40 paces. Not far, but accurate. And it pierced the hide of the heavy-pawed beast that the Red Claws wore as armor. He taught the 4 best hunters to shoot. They picked it up quickly. Their time in the prison camp had given them a steady hand and a sure eye. One of them was that very tall hunter with the small hand, for whom he had once made the first knife for her hand. She shot better than anyone. She would lie down behind the wall, take aim, exhale, release. The bolt would pierce the target 30 paces away, right in the center, time after time. Dan watched her and thought, she needs a real bow, a compound bow, with a crystal sight. Now a crossbow. Isa prepared in her own way. She came to Dan every evening, and they worked with crystals. He made a focusing device for her, a copper ring-shaped frame. Inside, a crystal secured with wire. The wire was wound around the crystal in a spiral. When Isa channeled energy into the crystal through the frame, the flow didn't go in all directions but in one direction, like a beam. Not scattered light, but a directed stream. The difference was like that between a candle and a lantern. Isa tried it. She aimed at a stone. The stone glowed red-hot and burst. She looked at her hands. There was no blood. There was no pain. In a single second, she had done what had previously cost her an entire crystal and her own health. She looked at Dan. More. He made more. By the start of the second week, Isa had 3 focusing inks, and she could fire a directed beam 20 paces without losing consciousness. It was a tactical move that Blooddroog could not have foreseen. Meanwhile, Dan was solving another problem: communication. In battle, commands must be relayed. A shout carries 50 paces. Beyond that, you can't hear anything. He made signal horns from bullhorns, 3 different tones. Low means retreat to the wall. Medium means hold your position. High means fire. A simple system, 3 commands. That was all that was needed for the first battle. He handed the horns to 3 commanders. Kenner on the right flank, the huntress on the left, Dan in the center on the wall. They rehearsed for 2 days. Signal, reaction. Signal, reaction. The tribe didn't know what formation and discipline were. They hunted in packs, every man for himself. Dan tried to break that in 2 weeks and didn't quite succeed. But they learned to listen to the horns and follow the 3 commands. That would be enough. It should be enough. On the 13th day, Kenner's scouts came running with news. Red Claws were a day's journey away. Tomorrow. Dan didn't sleep that night. He walked along the wall, checked every stone, every log, the moat, the crossbows, the supply of bolts, Isa's crystals, the horns. Nea found him at dawn. He was sitting on the wall, staring into the darkness. She sat down beside him. She was silent. Then she said, "You're afraid." He nodded. She placed her hand on his shoulder, a warm, heavy hand. "They'll do as you said." He shook his head. "I've never fought. I built water turbines and repaired factories. I don't know war." She paused. Then she said, "You know people. This is bigger." He wasn't sure she was right, but her hand on his shoulder helped. Dawn. fog rising from the river. Dan stood on the wall and looked toward the northern edge of the field. He waited. 50 fighters behind the wall. 4 crossbow women in position. Isa with 3 focusing rings behind the central section. Kenner on the right with 20 spearmen. The rest on the left flank and in reserve behind the second line of stones that Dan had placed 100 paces from the wall. Children and old people in the caves, Nia with them. She didn't want to leave. He asked her to. Someone had to be with the children. She nodded, but her eyes were heavy. They arrived in the middle of... The fog cleared and Dan saw them. More than 100 people, skins on their shoulders, flint spears, stone axes, painted faces. They weren't marching in formation. A crowd. A wide, loose crowd. Drog was leading the way. Dan saw him and understood why they called him Bloody. Huge, a head taller than the rest, as broad as a doorway, a necklace of fangs around his neck, his face painted with red ochre. In his right hand, a spear with a heavy-pawed bone tip. In his left, a stone axe. He walked ahead of his men and didn't hide. Drog stopped 100 paces from the wall. He looked. The wall, the moat, the palisade. He hadn't expected this. Dan saw him turn to his men and say something. They laughed, but the laughter was nervous. They hadn't seen walls before. They didn't know what it meant. Drog raised his spear and shouted, a battle cry. His men took it up. A roar, the pounding of feet. They ran. Dan raised his horn. His hands didn't tremble. Surprising. He thought they should be trembling. He waited. 50 paces, 40, 30. A high-pitched signal. Fire. 4 crossbows fired simultaneously. 4 bolts with copper tips flew forward. 3 hit their mark. 2 from the front row fell. The third clutched his shoulder. Those running behind them stumbled over the bodies. They lost their footing. They hesitated. Reload. 10 seconds. Dan counted. Fire. 4 more bolts, 2 more down. The red claws reached the moat. The first ones jumped into the water, knee-deep, icy. Their feet slipped on the clay bottom. They floundered and scrambled up the wall, while spears with copper tips stared down at them from above. Kenner struck first. His spear, with its weighted tip and shaft, pierced the shoulder of a climbing warrior and pulled him back into the moat. The spearmen struck along the entire line. The battle on the wall lasted 15 minutes. The red claws were scaling the wall. Greystone was throwing them down. Crossbows fired from behind the second line. Isa waited. Dan had told her, "Only when they break through, not before. Save your strength." They broke through on the left flank. A group of 10 warriors spilled over the wall where the palisade was lower. Dan gave the signal, a medium-pitched tone. The left flank retreats to the second line. A high-pitched tone. Crossbows on the breach. And Isa. She stepped out from behind the rocks. She raised her hand with the focusing ring. A blue beam struck the ground in front of the breachers, not at the people, at the ground. An explosion of mud and stones, a deafening bang. The warriors recoiled. A second beam, a third. The ground in front of them was exploding. They weren't wounded, but they were terrified. Magic from a shaman's hand is one thing. They knew shamans. But a beam that strikes like lightning and blows up the ground is another. They ran, back through the wall, into the moat, out onto the field. Drog stood 100 paces away and watched. His face changed. He saw the wall. He saw the crossbows. He saw magic that strikes like the fist of a god. He turned to his men. He gave an order. They retreated. They didn't run. They retreated, in an orderly fashion. Drog was the last to go. He turned toward the wall. He looked straight at Dan. 100 paces away, Dan could see his eyes. Not rage, understanding. Drog realized that the world had changed, and he left. 11 bodies remained on the field. Greystone lost 4 killed and 9 wounded. 4 killed. Names Dan knew, faces he saw every day. One of them was the man who had left the furnace construction site on the second day and then returned a week later. He had been standing on the left flank when they broke through. He didn't run. He stood. He was killed by 2 spear thrusts to the chest. Dan sat by his body that evening, looking at the dead man's face and thinking, I built the wall. I made the crossbows. I prepared the field. And still, 4 are dead. Nea found him. She took him away. He didn't resist. Grog died 2 days after the battle. Not from his wounds, from old age, which the wounds hastened. He stood on the wall during the fight even though Dan had asked him to go into the caves. The old chieftain didn't hide. A rock from the explosion struck him in the side. A rib cracked. For a young man, it's nothing. For a 70-year-old man in a world without medicine, it's a death sentence. He lay in his cave for 2 days. Issa sat beside him and channeled energy into him through the focusing ring. Gently, carefully, painlessly. The crystals glowed with an even blue light. The wound wouldn't heal. The body was too old, too worn out. Magic doesn't repair age. On the second night, Grog called for Dan. He lay on the skins, breathing hoarsely. His eyes were cloudy, but his voice was still firm. He said, I didn't know you could hold light in your hand. I'd like to see what you'll build next. Dan sat beside him and held his hand, the old chief's large, heavy hand. Grog looked at him. One last look, clear, steady, and closed his eyes. By morning, he was gone. The tribe buried their chief according to custom. The body on the hill, stones on top. The shamans sang. A crystal burned in the deceased's hand and slowly faded. Dan stood in the crowd and watched. Kennar stood in front. The chief's son, the heir. His face was stony, not a single tear, no tremor. But his hands were clenched into fists so tightly that blood oozed from under his fingernails. After the funeral, there was a gathering, the whole tribe, over 300 people on the clearing in front of the large cave. The question was simple. Who is the chief? According to custom, it is Kennar. The chief's son inherits the position. But custom allowed for another option, a collective choice. Anyone could stand up and name a candidate. The first to stand was an old hunter, a veteran, 2 scars across his face. He said a name, Dan. The second to stand was a woman from the Thin Creek refugees, the very same thin one with sunken eyes. She said a name, Dan. The third, the fourth, the fifth. Rand stood up and said, Dan. Nea stood up, Dan. 13 people in a row, one name. Kennar stood and listened. His face was stony, his fists were clenched. But he remained silent. Dan stood up. He raised his hand. Everyone fell silent. He spoke slowly. His language was not yet perfect, but it was sufficient. I will not be the chief. Silence. He continued, a chief is one who leads the hunt. I am a poor hunter. A chief is one who knows the forest and the beasts. I know stone and fire. These are different things. Kennar is your chief. He is the son of Grog. He is the best hunter. He knows your land. I am not a chief. I am a builder. He looked at Kennar. Kennar looked at him. There was something in his eyes that Dan had never seen before. Not jealousy, not fear, not anger. Confusion. An outsider could have taken power. The entire council was behind him, and he refused. Not out of weakness, out of understanding, Dan said. I need a different word, not a chieftain. I am the one who builds, the one who plans, the one who sees what is needed and does it. Issa spoke up from the crowd. Torkai Mar, an empty vessel that fills others. Dan shook his head. No, simpler. Kaimar, the one who sees and builds, the architect. The word hung in the air, A new word for a new role. Not a chief, not a shaman, not a hunter. The architect. The one who builds the world around him. Grog Jr., Kennar. He stepped forward. He looked at Dan for a long time. Then he turned to the tribe. I am your chief. He is your architect. So it was decided. And so it was. Kennar led the tribe. Dan built. 2 days later, Dan climbed the hill where Grog and the 27 dead had been buried. 27 stone graves. He stood before them. He took a knife from his smith's apron. Not copper, iron. The first iron knife in the history of this world. He had smelted the ore for 2 weeks, ruined 3 furnaces, burned his entire left hand. The blisters hadn't healed yet, but the knife was ready. The gray gleam of steel in the sunset light. Heavier than copper, stronger than copper, sharper than copper. He raised it above his head. The tribe had gathered below. Everyone. They looked at him against the backdrop of the red sky. He spoke slowly, one word at a time, so that everyone would understand. Tomorrow we will begin to build a city. Not a cave, a city, with walls, light, and warmth, so our children won't be afraid of the night, and so their children won't know what it means to bury friends in winter. He thrust the knife into the ground at Groga's grave. The steel sank a hand's length into the frozen earth. Nea stepped out of the crowd. She stood beside him, silently. Then Isa. Then Kenner. Then Ren. Then the huntress with the small hand. Then everyone else, one by one, 600 steps down the hillside. The wind carried the first snow, the last snow of the passing winter. And on the horizon, beyond the river, something flickered. A distant light. Not a bonfire. Something else. Even. Blue. The crystal lantern Dan had left on the wall glowed through the twilight. Far to the east, in the shadow of the trees, stood a man in a dark cloak. He was looking at the light. Not at the tribe. At the light. Then he turned and vanished into the forest. A scout. But not from Red Claws, and not from Sarvain, embroidered on his cloak. Silver thread, a star in a web, the order of the starry silk. He had seen enough. Dan began building the Kaidan 3 days after the funeral. He chose a spot on a hill half a kilometer from the caves, a flat clearing at a bend in the river. The river curved around the hill on 3 sides, natural protection. The 4th side faced the forest. This would be the main wall. He sketched the plan on the ground with a stick. Nea stood next to the sign and took notes. A perimeter wall, a stone foundation, a palisade on top. We'll replace it with brickwork later. A gate with a locking mechanism. Inside, 4 quarters, residential, workshops, storage, public. Water supply from the upper reaches of the river. Sewer system. Drainage ditches sloping toward the lower reaches. A separate outlet for the workshops, so that runoff from the smelter and dye house doesn't flow into the drinking water. Nea took notes. She didn't understand everything, but she wrote it down. Then she asked, "What is a sewer system?" He explained. Dirty water flows out of the town to one place, not underfoot, not into a well, into the river. Downstream, where we don't drink, she thought. The children won't get sick to their stomachs. Yes, the children won't get sick. The whole tribe built it. 300 people. Everyone did what they could. The men chopped wood and hauled stones. The women mixed clay and shaped bricks. The children carried water and handed tools. Ren worked at the furnace. He smelted copper for nails, staples, and hinges. Kenner organized the hunting and the guard duty, patrols every day. Scouts sent out 2 days' journey in every direction. He was a good leader, tough, fair, not as wise as Grog, but young and strong and willing to listen. Not to Dan. He listened to his people, the hunters, the elders, the women. Dan respected that. A month later, the first walls stood. 2 months later, the first houses. Not caves, houses. Wooden frames plastered with clay, roofs of poles covered with hides and birch bark. Inside, a hearth, a clay floor, a window covered with tanned hide that let in light. Naya entered the first house. She stood in the middle. She turned around. 4 walls, a roof, a stove, a floor, a window. She grew up in a cave. Her mother was born in a cave, and her mother's mother too, and hundreds of generations before them. She stood in the house, tears streaming down her face. Dan stood in the doorway and watched. He didn't go in. He let her be. This was her moment, not his. Then she came out. She wiped her eyes. She looked at him. "Which house is mine?" He pointed. "That one, by the workshop, next to mine." She nodded and went to move her things. The city was growing, a new house every week, a new wall every day. Dan slept only 4 hours a day. He designed, he calculated, explained, demonstrated, sketched. His hands were calloused. His back ached from the stones. His eyes were red from the furnace smoke. Nia made sure he ate. Isa made sure he didn't burn his hands in the furnace. Ren made sure the fire didn't go out. Kenner made sure no one got in the way. A team. Not by order, for a common goal. By the end of the second month of construction, there were 20 houses in Caden and 150 people living there. The rest were moving out of the caves gradually. The caves remained as storage and shelters in case of a raid. In the 6th month of construction, refugees arrived. Not 17, as in the winter, 50. The Long River tribe. Their shaman had died trying to repel a raid by unknown assailants. Not Red Claws. Someone else from the south. Mages in silk robes. They came, took the crystals, and carried off 20 young men and women. The rest were left behind. Tribute collectors. Sarvain. Dan listened to the elder of the Long River, an old woman with clear eyes and broken fingers. She spoke calmly, without tears. Facts. They came, they took, they left. Those who resisted were killed. The shaman was burned alive in front of everyone, to set an example. Dan listened and clenched his fists under the table. He had built the table a week ago, the first table in this world. Naya sat beside him and took notes. 50 mouths to feed, 12 of them children, 8 old people, 30 adults. Dan took them in. Working hands. More people meant more builders and more hunters, and more craftsmen. Naya assigned them to homes and jobs in a single day. A sign in her hands, sticks and badges. You here, you there. The children to the communal house, the elderly to the kilns, those who can sculpt to the potters, those who can sew to the tailors. Tailors. Dan taught the women to sew clothes from hides using patterns, not just to wrap themselves in a hide, but to cut it out, to sew it, to fit the figure, with sleeves, with pant legs. The pants were a sensation, the first batch of 10 pairs. The women tried them on and couldn't believe it. Separate legs. You can run, you can squat, you can work without having to adjust the hide every 10 steps. The men laughed at first. Then they tried them. Then they stopped laughing. Within a week, everyone was wearing pants. In the 7th month, Dan started up the water wheel. He'd been building it for 2 months. A wooden frame, blades made of planks, an axle from a solid log, bearings made of fired clay greased with fat. The river turned the wheel. The wheel turned the shaft via the axle. The shaft, via a belt drive made of leather strips, set 2 devices in motion. Bellows for the blast furnace, and a stone crusher for the ore. Before, Ren had pumped the bellows by hand, 8 hours a day. Now the river pumped the bellows for him. Before, Dan crushed the ore with a stone hammer, 2 hours per batch. Now the crusher did it in 20 minutes. Productivity had quadrupled. The wheel turned day and night. a continuous, steady creak of wood against wood. The tribe stood on the bank and watched. Water turns the wood pumps the leather blows into the fire melts the stone becomes copper, the copper becomes a knife, the river makes knives. Tira stood in front of everyone. She looked at the wheel. Then she turned to Dan and said, "Water never gets tired after all." He laughed. "No, it doesn't get tired." By the 8th month, the population of Kaiden had grown to 450. Rumors spread through the forest faster than the wind. A tribe with metal, warmth in winter, water that flows on its own, food in pots, clothes with legs. People came, in pairs, in fives, in families. Dan welcomed everyone. Nea assigned them. The town grew. New houses, new workshops, a pottery workshop, a blacksmith's, a tannery, a weaving workshop. Yes, a weaving workshop. Dan built a loom, the simplest kind, a vertical frame. Warp threads stretched between the top and bottom rails. A shuttle with weft thread, back and forth, thread by fabric, not silk, not cotton, made from plant fibers, nettles. In this world, nettles grew with long, strong fibers. The women soaked the stems, pounded them. They pulled out the fibers. They twisted the thread. They wove. The first fabric was coarse, stiff, ugly, but it was fabric, not hide. Fabric. It can be washed. It dries faster than hide. It is lighter. And it can be dyed. Isa showed him the plants used for dye. Roots that yield red. Leaves that gave green. Berries that gave blue. The first dyed fabrics came out spotty and uneven, but they were colorful. The children ran around in nettle shirts and were happy. In the middle of the 8th month, Dan went down into the lower chambers of the caves. He had been putting it off since day 1. Taboo. Don't go into the lower chambers. The elders told this to the children, and the children believed it. Dan didn't believe in taboos, but he respected them. He waited until he was important enough that they wouldn't stop him. He took a lantern, a crystal lamp in a copper casing, his best one, bright and steady. He went alone, didn't tell anyone, at night. The lower chambers began around a bend deep inside the large cave. A narrow passage, stalactites, wet walls. He walked for 20 minutes down the narrow corridor. Then the corridor widened. A chamber, large. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. The floor was smooth, too smooth for a cave. Worked. He raised his lantern. There were drawings on the walls. No, not drawings. Diagrams. Lines etched into the stone with something sharp. Circles, straight lines, angles. A diagram of something. A water wheel. He recognized the blades, the axle, the belt drive. Someone had drawn a water wheel on the wall of this cave, a long time ago. The lines were overgrown with mineral deposits, hundreds of years, maybe thousands. He went further. A second chamber. Here on the floor lay objects, copper ones, tools, a hammer with a copper head, a chisel, something resembling pliers, covered in a greenish patina, old, very old. He picked up the hammer. It had good balance. The handle was rotten, but the head was intact. Cast. Someone knew how to cast copper in molds. The third chamber. He froze in the doorway. A skeleton. A human skeleton on the stone floor, lying on its back, arms at its sides. A half-rotten piece of fabric nearby. He bent down, lifted the edge of the fabric. It crumbled in his fingers. But he'd seen enough. Blue fabric, heavyweight, double-stitched, copper rivets on the pockets, jeans. Nearby, scraps of another fabric. Checkered, red and black, a flannel shirt. Dan sat down on the floor. His hands were shaking. He wasn't the first. Someone had been here before him. Someone from his world, an American, in jeans and a flannel shirt. And he had died here, in the dark, alone. Next to the skeleton lay an object, small, rectangular, leather-bound. A notebook. He picked it up, carefully. The leather was cracked but held together. He opened it. The pages were yellowed. The ink had faded. But it was legible. English. The handwriting was small and neat. The first page, the date, 1943. A name, Thomas J. Reynolds, civil engineer, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Dan read, slowly, page by page. Thomas had ended up here the same way. A flash, a cave, a tribe. He built ovens, plumbing, copper tools, all the same. He had gone further than Dan. The drawings showed bridges, irrigation canals, windmills. He had lived here for 5 years. Then the entries changed. Alarming, brief. They found out. People in silk came from the south. They asked questions. Where did the knowledge come from? Who taught him? The last pages. The handwriting is shaky. They call themselves the Order. They say I'm upsetting the balance. They say the world isn't ready. The penultimate entry. The tribe's shaman is dead. They killed him because he was helping me. Tomorrow they'll come for me. The final entry. 4 lines. If anyone finds this, run north, not south, and don't build what can't be hidden. They hunt people like us. They always have. We are a disease to them. Dan closed the book, put it in his pocket, looked at the skeleton. Thomas J. Reynolds from Fort Wayne, civil engineer, ended up here in 43, built, taught, changed the world, was killed by the Order of the Starry Silk. Dan stood up, stood there for a minute. Then he bent down and smoothed the remnants of fabric over the bones, covered them like a blanket. You didn't build in vain. I'll carry on. He left the lower halls, told no one, hid the notebook in a secret compartment in his workshop, under a floorboard. He knew 2 things now. First, he wasn't the first. The world calls for builders before every eclipse. Second, there are those who kill builders, systematically, professionally, and they already know about him. He lay awake at night counting raindrops. 412. Sleep wouldn't come. For the first time in 8 months, he was counting raindrops again to keep his mind off things. The 9th month. Caden is no longer a camp or a settlement. A town. Small, dirty, noisy, but a town. 40 houses, 3 workshops, a blacksmith's, a potter's, a weaver's. Warehouses for grain and meat. A community house where children learn. A school. Dan hated the word school because in his mind, school meant desks and a blackboard and chalk. But here it was a covered courtyard with sticks for drawing on the ground. But the children were learning. To count. To name things. To understand numbers. He devised an alphabet. 26 symbols. Each symbol was a sound. Simple lines, angles, circles, easy to scratch into clay, easy to remember. Tira learned it in 3 days. The other children in a week. The adults were slower. Naya taught in the evenings after work. She ran a stick across a clay tablet, letter by letter, word by word. A month later, she was writing shopping lists with letters instead of sticks. Faster, more accurately. Ren was the second to learn, after Tira. He read Dan's blueprints and replicated the designs without explanation. The guy turned out to be a natural-born engineer. Not like Dan. Different. Dan thought in systems. Ren thought with his hands. He took a blueprint and felt how to build it, where the weak spot was, where the load would be distributed incorrectly. He couldn't explain it in words, he just knew. Dan made him the senior forger. Ren stood at the forge and hammered, and his movements were precise and calm, like a surgeon's. Issa worked with crystals every day. Dan built increasingly complex setups for her. The focusing ring became double. 2 rings on a single crystal. One focused the stream, the second set the direction. Isa could now heal from a distance, without touching the patient. She directed the beam, soft and warm. The wound closed, the bone healed, the fever subsided. And not a drop of blood from the nose, not a single new scar on her hands. She would visit Dan in the evenings. They would sit by the hearth and discuss crystals, energy, flows, resistance. She spoke the language of spirits. He translated it into the language of physics. In a surprising way, they described the same thing with different words. When she said, "The spirit of the crystal resists," he heard, "internal resistance of the source." When he said, "conduction losses," she nodded and said, "The path grows weary." 2 languages, 1 reality. One evening they had a fight. The first serious one. Isa wanted to use a large crystal for a protective dome over the city, a magical shield. Dan said no. 1 large crystal for 1 shield is wasteful. Better to have 10 small crystals for 10-point barriers. Distributed protection. She said he didn't understand magic. He said she didn't understand efficiency. She said his efficiency killed beauty. He said beauty wouldn't save you from a spear. They stood facing each other by the furnace. Their faces were red from the heat. Their eyes were burning. She was beautiful in that moment. That restless beauty that people with hot blood possess. He saw the scars on her forearms in the light of the fire, straight and parallel, old. She no longer cut herself. 5 months without new scars. Ever since he showed her the focusing rings. She had stopped seeing the need in pain. It was he who had given her that. Not the rings. The understanding that things could be different. She was the first to fall silent. She looked at him, then at the horn. Then she said quietly, "We're both right." He nodded. "We're both right." She smiled. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, the smile changed her face. It softened the sharpness. It added gentleness. He saw who she was before the scars and the rituals and the pain. A young woman with warm eyes. The moment lasted a second. Then she became Isa again, harsh, proud, a shaman. But he remembered. In the 10th month, Shira arrived. She came alone, from the forest, with a crossbow on her back. Not one of the 4 Dan had made for defense, a different one, a crude copy. Someone had seen a crossbow in battle and tried to replicate it, poorly. The arms were too short. The string was made of leather, not sinew. It shot 15 paces, not 40. But she came with this crossbow, and that meant the rumors had spread far. Tall, wiry, a scar across her right eyebrow, short, ragged hair, clothes in tatters, skinny to the point of transparency, dark, quick eyes. The eyes of someone who had lived alone for a long time and was used to looking in all directions at once. She walked up to the gate and stood there. She didn't ask. She didn't shout. She stood and waited. Kenner came out. "Who are you?" She gave her name. "Shira, Whiteroot Tribe." Kenner frowned. "Whiteroot has been destroyed. Red Claws. 2 months ago." She nodded. "I know. I'm the only one left." He led her to Dan. Dan was sitting in the workshop, working on a new project. A composite bow. Wood, bone, and horn glued together. Flexible and powerful. Twice as strong as a regular one. Shira walked in. She looked at the workshop, at the tools, at the blueprints on the wall, at the bow in Dan's hands. Then she looked at Dan. "You're that skinny smart guy who melts stones." He looked up. "And you're that woman who came with a crossbow made of sticks and rope." She didn't smile, but the corners of her lips twitched. "It works." "Poorly, but it works." Dan looked at the crossbow. He stood up. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He analyzed the design with his eyes. Replace the shoulders. Double the length. A bowstring made of triple braided sinew. The stock needs to be narrowed to fit her arms. Add a sighting bar. He looked at Shira, at her hands. Long fingers, slender wrists, but calluses on her fingertips. An archer. She shot a lot, and often. Sit down, eat, then we'll talk. She sat down. Nea brought food. Shira ate greedily and quickly, like someone who hadn't eaten in 3 days. When she finished, she told her story. Whiteroot lived in the north, a small tribe, 120 people. Shira was a hunter, the best. She was out hunting when the Red Claws came. She returned and saw smoke, bodies, all that was left. Family, mother, father, younger brother, everyone. She fell silent. Her face was stony, not a single tear. But Dan saw her hands. Her fingers dug into the edge of the table so hard the wood creaked. She had been walking for 2 months, alone, through the forest, eating whatever she found. She had heard rumors of a town on the river where a stranger made weapons out of stone. She came. Dan looked at her for a long time. "Do you want revenge, Droga?" She shook her head. "No. I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. To others." He nodded. "Stay." She stayed. A week later, Dan finished the composite bow. He gave it to her. She took it. She tried it on. She pulled the bowstring taut. The arrow flew 70 paces and lodged in a tree, just a hand's breadth deep. Shira lowered the bow. She looked at it, then at Dan, and said, "This is the most comfortable thing I've ever held." "And you kept this from the world?" He didn't keep it from the world. He just didn't have time. 3 days later, Shira was already commanding a squad of archers, 5 female hunters. She taught them to shoot not out of fear, but out of calculation. Distance, wind, anticipation, exhaling before the release. Calm. Dan watched her from the wall and thought, there she was, the commander he couldn't find. Not him, not Kenner, her. A marksman and a leader. She didn't need his knowledge of tactics, she needed his weapons, and she knew the tactics herself. Wolf tactics. Strike and run. Stretch out the enemy. Strike at the weak spot. Vanish. She was terrifying at it. Beautiful and terrifying. By the end of the 10th month, Caden was a city with a population of 530 people. Walls around the perimeter, gates, water supply, sewers, a smithy, a pottery workshop, a weaving workshop, a school, warehouses, watchtowers, a squad of archers under Shira's command, an arsenal of 12 crossbows and 6 composite bows, copper knives, spears, and axes for every fighter, focusing devices for Isa, crystal lamps along the main street. Dan stood on the wall in the evening and looked out at the city, at the smoke from the chimneys, at the lights in the windows, at the children running through the streets in nettle-stung shirts. 6 months ago, this was an empty hill. Now people live here. They eat hot food, sleep in the warmth. They aren't afraid of the night. Nea approached, stood beside him, silently. She often stood beside him in silence. That was their thing. No words, no gestures, just being there together. He turned to her. "They'll be coming from the south soon." She nodded. "I know. The harvesters." He nodded. "They're waiting for the village and the slaves. They'll see the city." She looked at the walls, at the towers, at the lanterns. Fine. Let them see. They came in mid-autumn. 2 riders on creatures Dan had never seen before. Long-legged reptiles with rust-colored scales, like 2-legged lizards the size of a horse. The riders wore silk robes over light leather armor, silver bracelets on their wrists, crystals on their belts. Mages. They stopped in front of the gate and didn't dismount from their lizards. One of them shouted up at the wall, in a language Dan didn't know. Not the tribe's language, another one, melodic, with long vowels. Kennar stood on the wall and didn't understand. Dan didn't understand either, but he picked up on the tone. A command, not a request. These people were used to giving orders. A minute later, the second rider switched to the language of the tribes, rough and broken, with an accent. He spoke slowly, as one speaks to children. "Open the gates. We come from the great lady Valissa al-Sarvain. You owe tribute. Crystals. People. Open up." Kenar looked at Dan. Dan shook his head. Kenar turned to the horseman. "The gates are closed. Tell the lady to come herself and we'll talk." The first horseman froze. Then he laughed. He raised his hand. The crystal on his bracelet flashed. A blue bolt of lightning struck the wall next to Kenar. Stones flew everywhere. Kenar staggered back. He didn't fall. He stayed on his feet. But a shard cut his cheek. Blood. The second rider spoke calmly. "This is a warning. Open up, or we'll be back with 200. They turned their lizard mounts around and rode off. They weren't in a hurry, confident. Dan stood on the wall and watched them go. Shira stood nearby with her bow. She could have hit both of them in the back from that distance. Dan put his hand on her bow. "Lower it." She looked at him. Her eyes were wild. She wanted to shoot. Every fiber of her being wanted to. "No, if we kill the messengers, they'll come back not with 200, but with 1,000. She lowered the bow, but her teeth were clenched so tight her jawbones turned white. Dan gathered the council. Kenar, Issa, Nea, Shira, Ron. 5 of them and him. 6 people at a table in the big house, lit by a crystal lamp. He spoke. "They'll return, not 2, but many, with mages. Sarvain's battle mages are stronger than Issa's, not because they're more talented, but because they have more crystals. Far more. Issa has 20 Minari. Sarvain's battle mage has 200. We won't stand a chance in direct combat." Shira. "So not direct combat. Ambushes. Traps." Dan shook his head. "No. No combat at all." Everyone looked at him. "Nea, what do you suggest?" "A trade." Silence. He continued. "They're coming for 2 things, crystals and slaves. We won't give up our slaves. We can trade the crystals, but not just give them away. Trade them. For what they have that we don't. Knowledge, books, seeds, fabrics, dyes, tools. We'll give them the crystals. They'll give us a future. Kenar. They don't trade with tribes. To them, tribes are livestock." Dan nodded. "Right. That's why they won't see a tribe. They'll see a city. Paved streets, water wheels, crossbowmen on the walls, people in clothes, children reading. They'll see something they didn't expect. And that will stop them. For a second, for a minute. That minute will be enough to start a conversation. And a conversation isn't a war. Issa. And if it doesn't stop them, then we have walls and archers and your rings. But that's a last resort." The council was silent. Then Kenar nodded first. Then Shira, reluctantly. Then Nea. Then Issa. Ron nodded last. He always agreed last because he thought longer than anyone else. Dan began to prepare. 2 months. That's how long he estimated before Valissa's visit. Maybe more. Winter. Southerners don't like the cold. Most likely spring. 6 months. He worked like a man possessed. He paved the streets with stone. Not all of them. The main one, from the gate to the square. So that Valissa would walk on stone and not on mud. First impressions. He painted the houses. White clay on the walls. Smooth. Clean. The city shone. He hung lanterns on every corner. Crystal ones. Warm blue light. At night, Caden glowed like a gemstone in the darkness of the forest. He sewed new clothes for everyone. Not ragged, nettle-stung rags. Proper clothes. Fabric dyed in bright colors. The cut was simple but neat. Pants, shirts, belts with copper buckles. He wanted so that when Valissa entered the gates, she would see not a tribe in animal skins, but people. At the same time, he was building defenses. 20 crossbows, 12 composite bows. Shira trained the archers every day. 36 fighters who could shoot 50 paces and hit the palm of a hand. He made a new device for Issa, a triple ring, 3 focusing circuits on a single crystal. The shot could pierce a stone wall an elbow thick. Issa tried it once and said, "No more. I understand." He nodded. "It's not for striking. It's so she'll see it and not want to test it. Restraint." He didn't know how that word sounded in the tribe's language and made up a new one. Torkaidar. An empty vessel that stops. Issa looked at him. "You make up a lot of words." "Someone has to." Nea was preparing the other side. Food. She was teaching the women to cook not just soup, but full meals. With seasonings. With presentation. On clay plates. With cloth napkins. Dan laughed when he saw the napkins. "How do you know about napkins?" She looked at him seriously. "To wipe your hands. Dirty hands are unattractive." She didn't know what etiquette was. She invented it herself, because she thought that dirty hands at the table were unsightly. He looked at her and thought, this woman could run a corporation. Ran was preparing a demonstration. Dan asked him to demonstrate the copper smelting process. The entire cycle: ore, horn, mechanism, smelting, casting, forging, the finished knife. From stone to metal in an hour. For a mage from Sarvain who had spent his whole life watching tribes strike flint against flint, this would be like a trip to the moon. Selene arrived before Valissa. 3 months earlier, she came alone, without a lizard, on foot, in simple clothes, with a small bag on her back, short, slender, dark hair tied in a bun, an intelligent face, smart eyes. She called herself a scholar, an ethnographer. She came to study the northern tribes. Dan didn't believe her for a second. Scholars don't walk alone through the glass desert. Scholars don't have such smooth palms without calluses, and scholars don't look over their shoulders every 30 seconds to check who's behind them. A spy. He took her in, showed her the town, led her through the streets, the workshops, the school, the blacksmith shop, the water wheel. She watched. She was silent. She wrote it down on a tablet, her own, with ink, real ink, on paper. Dan looked at the paper and his hands itched. Paper. They needed paper. He didn't know the recipe, but Selene did. On the 3rd day, she relaxed, just a little. She started asking questions. Not spy questions, real ones. "How do you know how to smelt ore?" He answered simply, "I studied." "Where?" "Far away." She accepted the answer, didn't press. Smart. On the 5th day, he saw her sitting in the school, listening to Tira teach the younger children the alphabet. Selene sat on the ground among the 6-year-olds and looked at the letters drawn on the clay wall with an expression Dan had seen before. On Nea, on Issa, on Shira. Recognition. She was recognizing something she had always known but had never seen brought to life. A school where children are taught to think rather than obey. Where knowledge is not a privilege, but a right. She stayed until the end of the lesson. Then she went outside. She stood by the wall. Dan approached. "You need a teacher who knows more than the alphabet." He looked at her. "Are you offering yourself?" She turned. "I was sent to study you, and perhaps to poison you." Silence. "But I won't, because this is the first place in my life where people listen to me when I speak." Dan looked at her for a long time. He believed her. Not because she was convincing, because he'd seen her eyes at school. "You can't fake that. Stay. Teach." She nodded, and for the first time in 5 days, she smiled. Valissa al-Sarvain arrived in early spring, not with 200 as the envoys had promised, with 300. 200 spearmen in leather armor, 50 mages in silk robes with crystals on their belts, 10 war lizards, and her. At the head of the column on a white lizard with silver harness. Tall, straight back, icy face, black hair gathered under a silver headband, light gray eyes, like a winter sky. She looked like a woman who had never heard the word no in her life. Dan stood on the wall and watched the column. Next to him, Shira with a bow, Kenner with a spear, Issa with a triple focusing ring on her arm, 30 crossbowmen on the walls, 12 archers in the towers. Behind the gates, 200 of Caden's spearmen in full battle formation, bronze spearheads, leather breastplates, wooden shields bound in bronze. Not an army, a militia. But a militia that stands in formation, holds the line, and knows the 3 horn signals. Valissa halted the column 200 paces from the gates. She looked at the city. Dan saw her face change. By the micrometer. First, confidence, then surprise, then something like bewilderment. Walls, stone, 3 men high, a palisade on top, watchtowers with flags, a moat filled with water in front of the wall, a paved road from the forest to the gates. And the gates. Double-leafed, oak, with brass hinges and a bolt. This wasn't a village. She had expected to see filthy savages in animal skins. She saw a city, a small one, but a town. She climbed down from the lizard, straightened her cloak, and walked toward the gates. Alone, unescorted. Dan appreciated that. Bravery, or arrogance, or both. He climbed down from the wall, exited through a side gate, stood before the gates, alone, unarmed, unarmored, in a clean dyed shirt and trousers and a blacksmith's leather apron. She approached, stopped 3 paces away, looked at him, from top to bottom. She was half a head taller than him. "You're that stranger." He replied in the language of the tribes. He knew she understood. Her messengers spoke it. "I am Dan, architect of Caden, and you are Valissa al-Sarvain. Welcome to my city." She raised an eyebrow. "Your city. Our city. I built it, but it belongs to those who live in it." She looked at him for 10 seconds. Then she said, "Open the gates. I want to see." He nodded, turned around, gave a signal. The gates opened, slowly, heavily. The hinges creaked, and for the first time in her life, Valissa al-Sarvain entered a city built by savages. He led her around for 3 hours. He didn't rush, he didn't brag, he just showed her. The main street, paved with stone, houses with whitewashed walls, windows, doors, smoke from chimneys, people in clothes, clean, colorful clothes, children running, laughing. Normal children in a normal city. Workshops, a smithy. Rand stood at the furnace and smelted copper. Valissa watched as the metal turned to liquid, as the liquid poured into a mold, as a spearhead emerged from the mold. Her face was impassive, but her eyes gave her away. She had never seen anything like this. Never. The mages of Sarvain worked with magic. Only with magic. Metal was trash to them. Stone was for slaves. Fire was for savages. But here, fire and stone created things that worked, without magic. A water wheel. The river turns the wood turns the bellows. The bellows blow into the furnace smelts the ore. The ore becomes copper. Copper becomes weapons, tools, and jewelry. A closed cycle, without a single drop of mana. Valissa stood and watched the wheel for 5 minutes without saying a word. The school. Tyra stood by the wall and showed the younger students the letters. Selene sat in the corner and wrote a lesson plan on paper. Valissa entered. She saw Selene. She stopped. Selene stood up. They looked at each other. Valissa knew who she was. Selene knew that Valissa knew. The silence lasted 10 seconds. Then Valissa turned to Dan and said, "You took my spy." "I didn't take her. She chose." Valissa looked at Selene. Selene didn't look away. Here, people listen to me when I speak. Valissa was silent. Then she nodded. A single, brief nod. There was something in that nod. Not anger, understanding. Lunch. Naya had outdone herself. The table. Clay dishes, cloth napkins, heavy paw meat in a herb sauce, fish baked in clay, berry drink in jugs, bread, real bread. Dan had learned to bake it a month ago from wild grain that the women gathered in the meadows. Coarse, heavy, but bread. Valissa sat at the table and ate, silently, slowly. She tasted every dish, every flavor. Then she placed her hands on the table. She looked at Dan. "What do you want?" He was ready for this question. He'd been preparing his answer for 2 months. A declaration. Not as a vassal, as an equal. Caden trades, doesn't pay tribute. We give crystals. You give knowledge, books, seeds, fabrics, masters who want to teach. She listened. Her face was impassive. "And if I refuse? Then you'll try to take it by force, and you'll lose people. Many people. We'll lose people too, but we're on our own land. And you're far from home, and you can't leave here in winter." She looked at him, gray eyes, cold, intelligent. "You're threatening me." "No, I'm describing reality. I'd prefer to trade." Silence. Then she did something he didn't expect. She laughed, quietly, briefly, but she laughed. "You're the first northerner who looks me in the eye and says no without shouting or waving a spear." Dan didn't smile. "I'm not a northerner. I'm a builder." She nodded. "I see." The negotiations took 3 days. Valissa bargained hard. Dan bargained patiently. Isa sat nearby and said nothing, but her triple ring glowed softly on her hand. A reminder. Kenar stood by the door with his arms crossed, Shira on the wall. Naya took notes. The result. Caden pays Sarvain 20 large crystals a year, not 100 as they used to take from the tribes. 20. Sarvain sends teachers, books, seeds of cultivated plants, weavers who know silk, and recognizes Kaidan as a self-governing city, not a vassal, not a slave, a trading partner. Valissa signed. On paper. Her own paper. With her own ink. Dan placed his signature next to hers. The first international treaty in the history of Caden. Valissa left on the 4th day. Before her departure, she approached Dan. Alone. Without an entourage. "My father wants to kill you, I know. My brother wants to burn your city, I know. I'll hold them off. For now. But build faster. You have less time than you think." She turned and left. The convoy headed south. Without slaves. No looting. With 20 crystals and a treaty. Dan stood at the gate and watched them go. Naya was beside him. "She believes you." "No. She believes what she saw. That's more reliable." After Valissa left, Dan didn't sleep for 2 days. Not out of fear. Out of plans. Valissa had given him time. But time is finite. Valissa's father, Lord Taran al-Sarvain, ruled one of the 4 great houses of the southern kingdoms. Her brother Marcus was a sadist with an army and crystals. And somewhere in the shadows behind them stood the Order of Star Silk. Thomas Reynolds's notebook lay under a floorboard in the workshop, and Dan reread it every night. They hunt people like us. They always have. He needed more people, more weapons, more knowledge, more time. He didn't have time. He started with the roads. It sounds silly. War is at the doorstep and he's building roads. But roads aren't muddy trails you can only walk on in the summer. Roads are connections, trade, speed, the ability to move people and weapons in hours, not days. The first road connected Kaidan with the Blue Lake tribe in the northwest. 30 kilometers. Trodden earth reinforced with gravel, with drainage ditches on either side. A month's work, 200 men. The Blue Lake tribe joined the Union voluntarily. Their chief came to Kaiden, saw the city, and said one word: yes. The second road led east to the Stone Bulls tribe. They bargained. They wanted copper knives for every hunter and a stove in every cave. Dan gave them what they wanted. The third road led southwest to a small clan of fishermen who lived on the lake and controlled the best fishing spots in the area. They joined the Union for crossbows and a promise of protection. By the end of the second year, Kaiden had 7 tribes under his control, 3,000 people. Dan did not rule them. Kenner did not rule them. Each tribe kept its own chief, but all recognized Kaiden as the center. Roads, trade, weapons, protection. A general council. Dan called it the Union of 7 Moons, after the number of moons in the sky. Nia kept records for the entire Union. Population, supplies, production, needs. Her tablets grew into an entire archive. Clay shelves in a special room, in rows, labeled, dated. She created an accounting system from scratch, without education, without examples, pure managerial intuition. Dan looked at her archive and thought, this woman needs paper. Selene knew the recipe: plant fibers, soaking, pressing, drying. They experimented for a month. Nettle fiber turned out to be too coarse. The inner bark of a local tree resembling a mulberry tree worked. The first sheet of paper was warped, gray, and spotted, but you could write on it. Selene wrote the first word: Kaiden. Then she looked at Dan, and he saw tears in her eyes. She had lived 24 years in Sarvain, in a society where a woman's knowledge was considered a decoration, where her mind was used for espionage because it was supposedly good for nothing else. And here she was, making paper, and wrote textbooks, and taught children, and they listened to her. Dan appointed her Minister of Education, not officially. There were no official titles yet. He simply said, "You're in charge of all the schools, of all the textbooks, of all the teachers. Do as you see fit." She nodded, and from that day on, she worked 16 hours a day, just like all of them. Issa had advanced further than anyone else. Dan's crystal devices in her hands became something greater than he had intended. She learned to sense the currents through the copper wires, not with her eyes, not with her hands, with something internal. She could tune the crystal to a specific frequency and transmit a signal along the wire over a distance, like a telegraph. Dan didn't believe it until he saw it himself. Issa stood in the smithy. Tara stood on the wall 300 paces away. Between them, a copper wire stretched on poles. Issa touched the crystal. Tara on the wall flinched. She turned. She cried out. She said, "Fire!" A connection. An instantaneous magical connection across the distance. Tara, the girl who hears the crystals sing. She was 14. Dan found her in her second year in the ruins of a burned-down village. She was sitting alone, amid the ashes, silent, not crying, just sitting and listening to something no one but her could hear. He brought her to Kaiden, gave her food, a home, a job. She could tune crystals with a single touch, without tools, without knowledge. She simply heard the right frequency and turned the stone until it sang cleanly. Every crystal installation in the city passed through her hands. Without her, nothing worked as it should. Dan gave her a title: Chief Resonator. She looked at him with serious eyes and asked, "Does that mean I'm important?" "It means you're irreplaceable." She didn't smile, but her shoulders straightened, just a little. For the first time in her entire life, someone had told her she wasn't broken, that her strange ears weren't a curse but a gift. The communication line between Kaiden and the nearest settlements was up and running by the middle of the second year. Wire on poles, relay crystals every 500 paces. Tara had set it all up personally. Now Kaiden knew what was happening at the Union's borders in a matter of minutes. Not days. Minutes. Dan stood on the wall and looked out over the city. 3,000 people, 7 tribes, roads, communication, an army, schools, paper. He stood and thought of Thomas Reynolds, who had reached the water wheel and the bridges and had been killed. Dan had gone further, much further. And those who had killed Thomas surely already knew it. The Order of Star Silk came quietly. Not as an army, not as mages in silk, just one man. An old man, short, thin, plain clothes, a gray cloak, a travel bag. Nothing remarkable. He walked through the gate in the afternoon, nodded to the guard. He bought a flatbread from a vendor in the square, sat on a bench and ate, looked around. Tara found him first. She approached Dan in the workshop and said, "A man in the square. His crystals are screaming." Dan looked up. "Screaming." She nodded. "He has 3 stones under his clothes, big ones. They're angry. I can hear them." Dan went to the square. He approached the old man, sat down next to him, silently. The old man looked at him, dark eyes, calm. The eyes of a man who has seen many deaths and stopped counting them. "You are the architect." Dan nodded. "You know who I am. You are from the Order." The old man tilted his head slightly. "I came to talk. Thou shalt not kill. For now." Dan didn't flinch. His hands were steady. His voice was even. "Speak." The old man pulled a medallion from under his cloak, a silver star in a web, a symbol Dan had seen in Thomas's notebook. "Our order has existed for 3,000 years. We watch, guardians of balance. The world of Khaitan lives by its own laws. Magic and nature, spirits and people. Balance. Sometimes strangers come. From other worlds. They bring knowledge this world was never meant to receive. We keep an eye on them. And if they go too far, we stop them." Dan listened. "You killed Thomas Reynolds." The old man blinked, his only reaction. "You found the lower halls." "I found his notebook. And his skeleton." Silence. The old man placed his hands on his knees. Reynolds was dangerous. He started building bridges, roads, irrigation systems. In 5 years, he advanced one tribe 2,000 years into the future. The world isn't ready for this. Dan looked at him. "In 3 years, I've advanced 7 tribes 5,000 years into the future." The old man nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here." They were sitting on a bench in Kaidan Square. People were walking around. Children were running. Ran was carrying copper ingots to the smithy. Naya walked by with a tablet, calculating something as she went. A normal day in a normal city. Dan spoke quietly. "The great eclipse is in 2 years. The deep ones will crawl out from under the ground. Last time half the tribes perished. Without my walls and weapons, they'll all perish." The old man looked out at the square. "Or not all of them. The world managed for thousands of years. Before you, half were lost, half survived. That's how the balance works." Dan clenched his fists. "Half. You talk about half as if they were acceptable losses. That's thousands of people, children, old people, women. Your balance stands on their bones." The old man was silent. Then he said, "Every outsider says that. Everyone wants to save everyone. Everyone builds. And in the end, everyone creates weapons with which people kill people. You've already made crossbows. Tomorrow, you'll make swords. The day after tomorrow, siege engines. In 10 years, your descendants will be fighting each other with your weapons. We've seen it. 6 times. Over 3,000 years. Every stranger started with furnaces and knives, and everyone ended in war." Dan sat and said nothing. Because the old man was right, partly. He was already thinking about siege engines. He was already designing ballistas. He was already planning the production of iron swords. He knew where this was leading. He knew the history of his world. The Bronze Age, the Iron Age, gunpowder, the atomic bomb. A straight line from the first knife to the end of the world. But he looked at the old man. You saw my city. You saw the school. Children are learning to read, to count, to think. This isn't a weapon. It's knowledge. Yes, I made crossbows, but I also made plumbing, ovens, paper, medicine, communication. I don't build weapons. I build civilization. Weapons are a part of it, not the goal. The old man shook his head. Fine words. Reynolds spoke similar ones. He built a school too, and a water system. And then his tribe took his crossbows and went after their neighbors for resources. He didn't want that, but it happened, because weapons exist to be used. Dan was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You're here to kill me." The old man looked at him. "I'm here to decide if it's necessary." How was he any different from Reynolds? How was his town different from the one Thomas had built 80 years ago? Dan stood up. "Let's go. I'll show you something." He led the old man to the school. Tira was teaching a class. 12 children aged 6 to 10 sat on the floor solving problems. Not arithmetic, problems of a different kind. Selene had designed the curriculum for him. Tira was explaining. A question written in chalk on the clay wall. The Blue Lake tribe has few fish. The Stone Bulls tribe has plenty of fish but no knives. How to help both? The children answered. Trade. Give knives for fish. Teach them to fish. Build a road between them. Every answer was discussed. Every child listened to the others. The old man stood at the entrance and watched. He was silent for 10 minutes. Then he turned to Dan. "This is unusual." Dan nodded. "Reynolds built things. I build people who build things. The difference. If they kill me tomorrow, these children already know how to think. They will carry on. Not because I ordered them to, because they understand why. A weapon without a mind is a stick. Knowledge without a conscience is a bomb. But knowledge with a conscience is civilization. I teach both." The old man stood and watched the children. One girl raised her hand and said, "Maybe Blue Lake will learn to make knives on its own, and then they won't have to depend on the Stone Bulls." Tira smiled. "Good answer." The old man turned to Dan. "I won't kill you today, but the Order will be watching. If you become what the others have become, we will come." Dan nodded. "Fair enough." The old man turned and walked away, through the gate, down the road, into the forest. Dan stood and watched him go. Shira approached. "How many?" "2. 2 were watching from the woods while he was here. She was holding a bow. Arrows knocked." "Why didn't you let me shoot?" "Because he's right. Partly. And because killing the messenger means declaring war on those we cannot defeat." She spat. "I hate it when you're right." He smiled, but the smile was heavy. The great eclipse began a year early. Tara was the first to hear it. She woke up in the middle of the night and screamed, not out of fear, out of pain. All the city's crystals vibrated at once. The lamps flickered. The focusing devices hummed. The wire rang like a string. Dan ran out of the house. He looked up. 7 moons, all 7, in the sky, all at once. They were lining up in a row, slowly, inexorably. A white chain of lights stretching from the horizon to the zenith. There was supposed to be a year left until the eclipse. A year they no longer had. He ran to the workshop, grabbed a map, unfolded it on the table. A map of the Union. 7 settlements. Roads, communication lines, fortifications. He knew every inch of it. Knew where the walls were strong, where they were weak, where they could hold their ground, where they couldn't. Nea was there a minute later, with a clipboard, supplies, people, weapons. She didn't ask what was happening. She saw the moons. Issa was the third to arrive. Her face was pale. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from overload. Crystals all over the city were screaming in her head, and she could hear every single one. The ground was rumbling. Dan looked at her. Where? She closed her eyes, concentrated. Everywhere. But strongest in the northeast. A fault line. A big one. And in the south, 2 or 3. The deep ones will come from there. He sent a signal via the crystal network. All settlements, general alert. Answers came an hour later. All 7 tribes on their feet, awaiting orders. Dan worked non-stop. 3 days, 3 nights. No coffee, no tea. Nea brought him a hot herbal brew that kept him awake and prevented him from thinking about sleep. He was designing the defenses, the central fortress, Caden, reinforced walls, an additional moat, ballistas on the towers. Yes, ballistas. He had built 3 over the past 6 months, heavy, wooden, with counterweights. They hurled 10-kilogram stone projectiles 200 paces. Overkill against people. Against the deep ones, perhaps not. He didn't know the deep ones. No one alive did. The last eclipse was 100 years ago. Only stories remained. Creatures from beneath the earth. Big, many legs, many eyes, armor. They come in waves. They don't think. They don't feel. They just crawl. And they devour. Issa knew more. The spirits spoke to her. She sat up at night and listened to the crystals. Tara beside her. 2 women who heard the voices of stones. The deep ones fear light. Strong, bright light. And sound. High-pitched sounds disorient them. Light and sound. Dan could provide both. Crystal spotlights. Concave copper reflectors. A crystal at the focus. A directed beam of pure white light. Brighter than any torch. Brighter than a bonfire. Like a car headlight. He built 20 of them. Placed them along the walls. Crystal sirens. Tara tuned the frequency. High. Almost beyond human hearing. The crystal vibrating at this frequency through the copper resonator produced a sound that made Dan's teeth ache. It would be worse for the deep ones, he hoped. The Union Army. 5,000. Not all fighters. Militiamen. Farmers with spears. Fishermen with crossbows. Women with bows. But all armed. Everyone knew the 3 horn signals. Everyone stood in formation. Shira commanded the archers. 300 archers and crossbowmen. Her unit had become the Union's finest. They fired in volleys, on command. 30 arrows in the air at once. 30 arrows falling onto a 10 by 10 step square. A wall of iron. Kenner commanded the spearmen. 1,000 men with bronze spears and wooden shields. He taught them to hold formation. Not perfectly, but well enough. A wall of shields. A forest of spears. The second row strikes over the first. The third provides support. Dan commanded them all. From the command center. A stone tower in the center of Caden. Upstairs, a table with a map. A crystal link to all sectors. Tara was nearby, his radio operator, his eyes and ears. She received signals from the lookouts on the walls and relayed his orders to the sector commanders. He wasn't fighting. He was directing the war. From the tower. With the map. Like a chess player at the board. On the 4th day after the eclipse began, the earth shuddered. A real earthquake. The walls of Kai cracked in 2 places. Ran rushed to repair them. He filled the cracks with molten copper. Improvisation. But it held. On the 5th day, something crawled out of the fissure in the northeast. The sentry on the far tower sent a signal via crystal communication. Tara turned to Dan. Her face was white. They're coming. Lots of them. Dan climbed onto the wall. He looked north. At first he saw trees. Trees were falling, one after another, as if an invisible hand were pushing the forest. Then the deep ones emerged from behind the trees. And Dan realized that all his preparations might not be enough. They were huge. Not like a bear, like a house. Their armor was dark and shiny. 6 legs, each as thick as a tree. a flat head with 2 rows of eyes and jaws that ground tree trunks like kindling. The first deep one emerged from the forest onto the clearing in front of the wall. Behind it, the second, the third, the 10th, the 20th. They moved in a wave, not fast, but unstoppable. The ground shook beneath their footsteps. Dan returned to the tower. He sat down at the map. His hands weren't shaking. He didn't know why. Maybe because there was no time to tremble. Tara, contact all sectors. She nodded, eyes huge, hands on the crystals. To all sectors. Turn on the searchlights, turn on the sirens. Archers, get ready. Spearmen to the wall. Load the ballistae. Light blazed from 20 searchlights. White beams cut through the twilight.